The rain pounded mercilessly against the wooden roof of the small, secluded cabin deep in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness. The wind howled like a restless spirit, weaving through the dense pine trees, rattling their branches in a ghostly symphony. Inside the cabin, Henry sat in his worn-out recliner, the dim light of a flickering oil lamp casting elongated shadows on the log walls. He was a man accustomed to solitude, his only companion being the quiet crackle of the fireplace and the occasional hoot of an owl. Life had been this way for years, and he had long since made peace with the silence. But tonight, that silence was disturbed. A strange sound, faint but persistent, barely audible over the storm's rage, reached his ears. A scratching? No, more like a soft thumping. Henry furrowed his brow, placing his mug of lukewarm coffee down as he rose to his feet. It was rare for anyone to venture this deep into the woods, and even rarer for them to knock at his door at such an hour. His fingers brushed a shotgun that rested near the doorway, a habit more than a necessity. With slow, measured steps, he approached the wooden door and pressed his ear against it, listening intently. Another soft thump, a whimper, a sound so fragile it barely seemed real. Cautiously, he unlatched the door and pulled it open. The sight before him was enough to freeze him in place. A small, drenched bear cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, lay collapsed on his doorstep. Its fur was matted with mud and rain, its tiny body shivering violently against the cold. But what caught Henry's attention most was its leg, twisted unnaturally, swollen, and streaked with blood. The cub's dark, round eyes met his, wide with pain but filled with something else, something desperate. Henry had seen many things in his time in the wild, but never had he seen a bear cub come to a human willingly, let alone knock on a door as if asking for help. He hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to close the door, to let nature take its course. Wild animals did not belong in human homes. And yet, as he watched the cub struggle to lift its head, as if pleading with him, something deep inside him shifted. With a heavy sigh, he knelt down. "What are you doing out here, little one?" he murmured, his voice barely audible over the storm. The cub let out a weak, pitiful cry, its tiny paw twitching. Henry glanced around, scanning the darkness for any sign of the mother bear. His gut told him she was long gone, whether taken by predators or lost to the wilderness. He could not say. What he did know was that this cub had no chance of surviving the night alone in such a state. Muttering a few choice words under his breath, Henry did something he never thought he would. He scooped up the tiny creature into his arms. The cub barely resisted, its body too exhausted to fight. It was lighter than he expected, all skin and bones beneath its thick fur. As he carried it inside, he could feel the rhythmic tremors of its shivers against his chest. The door creaked shut behind them, sealing them both away from the raging storm. The cabin was warm, filled with the scent of burning wood and old leather. Henry gently placed the cub on a pile of soft blankets near the fireplace, his mind racing. He had no experience tending to wild animals, let alone a bear cub with a broken leg. Yet, as the tiny creature let out a small sigh and nestled into the warmth, a strange sense of responsibility settled over him. He had made his choice. Whatever happened next, he could not turn back now. Henry had spent years living alone in the vast Alaskan wilderness, but nothing had prepared him for this. Caring for an injured bear cub that had quite literally knocked on his door. The storm outside had begun to settle, the wind no longer howling like a banshee through the trees, but his cabin was filled with a different kind of unrest. The small cub lay curled up on the pile of blankets, its breathing uneven, its injured legs stretched out awkwardly. Henry crouched beside it, observing the swollen limb with a wary eye. He had patched up his own wounds plenty of times, had even tended to the occasional injured bird or rabbit in the past. But this was entirely different. This was a wild bear, even if it was just a baby. He ran a rough hand over his beard, thinking. The first step was obvious. Clean the wound, check for any deep cuts or breaks. He retrieved his old first aid kit, a relic from his days as a park ranger before he had left that life behind. Kneeling next to the cub, he carefully examined its leg. The swelling was severe, the flesh darkening in places where the bruising was worst. Henry grimaced. This wasn't just a sprain, it was a break, and a bad one at that. If the cub had stayed outside much longer, the cold alone would have worsened its condition. He hesitated for only a moment before retrieving a clean cloth and a bottle of antiseptic. As he gently dabbed at the cub's wound, the tiny creature let out a whimper, its body tensing under his touch. Henry paused, his weathered face softening. "I know, kid," he murmured, his voice surprisingly gentle. "This ain't gonna feel good." The cub's dark eyes flickered open, watching him with a mix of pain and something else, trust. It was a look Henry had seen before in the eyes of injured animals, a quiet surrender to the hands that were trying to help. That look struck something deep inside him. He had spent so long distancing himself from the world, telling himself that he didn't need anything or anyone. And yet, here he was, tending to a fragile life that had appeared on his doorstep. With careful precision, he cleaned the leg, working quickly to minimize the cub's discomfort. The animal trembled under his hands, but did not try to bite or claw at him. Henry took that as a good sign. He had expected resistance, fear, but all he found was exhaustion and acceptance. Once the wound was clean, he set about making a splint. He scavenged a few sturdy pieces of wood from an old crate and secured them to the cub's leg using strips of cloth. His fingers worked with practiced ease, memories of his past life resurfacing, days spent in the field, mending broken wings and twisted paws. When he was done, he sat back, exhaling slowly. The cub let out a small, weary sigh, its body relaxing slightly into the warmth of the blankets. Henry watched it for a moment before standing and heading to his small kitchenette. He rummaged through his supplies, searching for something the cub could eat. He knew bears were omnivores, but he had no idea what a cub this young would need. He settled on a mixture of warm water and a bit of honey, stirring it together in a shallow dish. "All right, kid," he said, returning to the fireplace. "Let's see if you'll take this." He carefully tilted the dish toward the cub, and after a few hesitant sniffs, the tiny creature lapped at the liquid. Henry felt an unexpected surge of relief. At least the cub had an appetite. That was a good sign. Over the next few days, Henry fell into an unexpected routine. He changed the cub's bandages, ensured it stayed hydrated, and even found himself talking to it as if it were another person. The cub, who he had started calling Lucky, watched him with keen eyes, its small ears twitching whenever Henry spoke. At first, the cub barely moved, too weak and injured to do more than eat and sleep. But as the days turned into weeks, Lucky began to grow stronger. The swelling in its leg gradually reduced, and Henry could see the determination in the little creature's eyes whenever it tried to move. One crisp morning, Henry woke to the sound of tiny, unsteady steps on his wooden floor. He turned his head from where he lay on his cot and saw Lucky attempting to stand, its injured leg still splinted but supporting more weight than before. Henry watched in silence as the cub wobbled forward, its tiny claws clicking against the floorboards. It wasn't graceful, but it was progress. "Look at you," Henry said, a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Tough little thing, aren't you?" Lucky let out a small grunt in response, its nose twitching as it sniffed the air. Henry had started leaving out bits of softened fruit and cooked fish, and the cub had taken a particular liking to salmon. The little guy was eating more now, and Henry had no doubt that in time it would regain its full strength. But there was an unspoken truth lingering in the back of Henry's mind. Lucky wasn't meant to stay. As much as he had grown used to the cub's presence, as much as the quiet cabin now felt fuller with the tiny creature padding around, Henry knew that one day soon, Lucky would have to return to the wild. The realization hit him harder than he expected. He had spent years pushing people away, living with only the trees and the wind as company, convincing himself that loneliness was his choice. But now, with Lucky curled up beside the fireplace, breathing peacefully, He felt something he hadn't in years: purpose. And just like that, the man who had spent so long avoiding attachments found himself dreading the day he would have to let go. But that day hadn't come yet. Not today. Today, Lucky still needed him. Henry reached over, his rough fingers gently brushing against the cub's soft fur. Lucky stirred but didn't wake, trusting him enough to remain nestled in his presence. Henry sighed, leaning back against his chair. He had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of it. The first hint of spring arrived in the Alaskan wilderness, like a whisper, subtle but undeniable. The snow, which had blanketed the land in thick, unrelenting layers, had begun to melt, revealing patches of dark earth beneath. The trees, once heavy with ice, now rustled gently with the promise of new life. Birds had returned, their calls breaking the long silence of winter. For the first time in months, the air carried the scent of damp soil and renewal. Inside the cabin, Henry sat on his porch, a steaming cup of coffee cradled in his callous hands, watching Lucky with a mixture of pride and something heavier: dread. The little bear cub had changed. Gone was the frail, shivering creature that had knocked on his door in the middle of a storm. Lucky was stronger now, his fur thicker, his body sturdier. His once awkward, limping steps had turned into confident strides. He moved with the curiosity and energy of a growing cub, no longer hindered by his once broken leg. The splint had come off weeks ago, and while he still favored the limb on occasion, it was clear that he was healing. Henry had done what he set out to do. He had saved Lucky's life. But in doing so, he had given something of himself away. He had let himself care. Lucky had become more than just a wild animal to him. He had become company, a presence in the otherwise empty corners of Henry's life. And now, that presence would soon leave. The signs were there. Lucky had grown restless, his natural instincts beginning to stir. He sniffed at the wind more often, his small nose twitching as if catching scents Henry couldn't. He pawed at the door when the cabin felt too confining, his dark eyes filled with longing whenever Henry took him outside. The cub had begun climbing trees, scratching at the bark with his developing claws, testing his strength against nature. He was no longer just a cub in need of care. He was a bear, and he was meant for something bigger than this small cabin. Henry knew it, and yet, when the time came, he still wasn't ready. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, Henry stood at the edge of the clearing, Lucky by his side. The cub was sniffing the air again, ears perked up. The forest called to him. Henry exhaled slowly, kneeling down to the cub's level. Lucky turned to him, tilting his head as if sensing the weight of the moment. "You're ready, aren't you, kid?" Henry murmured, his voice quieter than usual. He reached out, running a hand through the thick fur between Lucky's ears. The cub didn't pull away. He had grown accustomed to Henry's touch, the way Henry spoke to him, the way Henry had taken care of him. But this was the part where they had to say goodbye. Henry swallowed the lump in his throat, feeling foolish. He was a grown man, a man who had chosen isolation for years. And yet, the thought of waking up tomorrow and not seeing Lucky curled up by the fireplace made his chest ache in a way he wasn't prepared for. Lucky nudged his hand with his wet nose, as if urging him to understand something neither of them could put into words. "You'll do all right out there," Henry continued, his voice rougher now, thick with emotion. "You're a tough one." Lucky let out a soft grunt, his little claws digging into the damp earth beneath them. He looked back at the trees, the wilderness stretching endlessly beyond the clearing. The wind rustled the branches, whispering of adventure, of freedom. Henry clenched his fists, forcing himself to take a step back. Then another. Lucky turned his head once more, staring at him for a long moment. Henry had the sudden, irrational thought that maybe he wouldn't leave. Maybe Lucky would stay, choosing the warmth of the cabin over the uncertainty of the wild. But Henry knew better. And sure enough, after what felt like an eternity, the cub took his first real steps away from the only home he had known. One hesitant step, then another, and then he was moving, disappearing into the trees, swallowed by the shadows of the forest. Henry stood there long after the cub was gone, staring at the place where he had last seen him, feeling the silence settle around him like a heavy weight. It was done. Lucky was gone, and Henry was alone again. The days that followed were quieter than before. The cabin, once filled with the sound of tiny paws on the wooden floor, now felt emptier than ever. Henry caught himself glancing at the pile of blankets by the fireplace, expecting to see a small, sleeping form nestled there. He found himself listening for soft grunts, for the telltale sound of scratching at the door. But the cabin remained silent. Life moved on. Henry kept himself busy, chopping firewood, fishing by the river, tending to the small garden he had started the year before. The snow had melted completely now, giving way to the full vibrance of spring. The world outside was teeming with life, but Henry felt its absence keenly. Still, he told himself he had done the right thing. Lucky belonged out there, among the trees, beneath the open sky, not in a man's cabin, not with him. And so, he moved forward, even as a part of him felt like it had been left behind. But then, something happened. One morning, weeks after Lucky had left, Henry stepped onto his porch, stretching his sore muscles as he prepared for another day of solitude. But as his eyes scanned the clearing, he froze. There, at the edge of the trees, stood a figure. Not a man, a bear, a bigger, healthier, stronger bear. Henry's breath caught in his throat. Lucky. The cub had grown in just a matter of weeks, his one small frame filling out, his muscles more defined. His fur was sleeker, his posture more confident. He was a young bear now, no longer the fragile creature Henry had taken in. But despite all that, there was something unmistakable in his eyes. Recognition. Henry swallowed hard as Lucky took a step forward, then another. Not with hesitation this time, but with purpose. The bear approached the porch, stopping just a few feet away. He stared up at Henry, and for a moment, neither of them moved. And then Lucky did something that made Henry's heart clench. He sat down, right there, at the foot of the porch, just as he used to when he was a cub. Henry let out a slow breath, feeling an unexpected warmth spread through him. He didn't speak, didn't move, didn't dare break the moment. Lucky wasn't here because he needed help. He wasn't here because he was lost. He was here because he remembered, because he hadn't forgotten the man who had saved him. And Henry realized in that moment that he hadn't been left behind after all.